What's up, South Hills? Mr. Barley, back at you again with another lesson about the Revolutionary War. We talked earlier about the Stamp Act and how the Stamp Act had created a lot of tension between the colonists and the British. The British, of course, wanting to tax colonists, hoping to make money to recoup the losses that they had incurred during the French and Indian War. Tensions just continued to rise. The British continued to tax the American colonists by putting taxes on additional goods. Everything from a shovel to sugar was beginning to be taxed by the British. The American colonists became more and more violent and angry and resistant to these British taxes. The image that you're seeing here is an event known as the Boston Massacre, and it's one of those tipping points in the Revolutionary War. It was at this point that the American colonists lost all trust in the British Army. You have to understand, as colonists, for 150 years, the British Army was considered to be the protector of the colonies, and colonists enjoyed that protection and respected this army. It all ended on this day. So it happened in February 1770. Tension was increasing in the streets of Boston between loyalists and patriots. Loyalists, of course, people who wanted to remain with Britain, and patriots who wanted to break away. Brawls were common. Windows were smashed out of loyalist shops. Clubs would come out. There was even fistfights between British soldiers and American patriots. So things are getting really crazy. This is a real seminal moment. This is the moment when real true bloodshed happened in the streets over this taxation. Okay, so let's set the stage. It's February, super cold in Boston, 1770. A group of colonists, patriots, were out in front of a custom house, and they were protesting the taxation of the British. Now, a custom house is just a place where all the tax money was housed by the British. This crowd slowly but surely grew throughout the day and became more and more unruly and violent. And what happened is the British, fearing that the custom house would be robbed or burnt down, set up a defensive line of British soldiers in front of it. Pretty soon, rocks were being thrown, insults were being hurled. They even threw horse poop at each other. And the British regular soldiers, being essentially the best trained soldiers in the world at that time, pretty much just took the abuse. At some point, no one knows exactly how this happened, but someone yelled fire. When that happened, the British opened fire on this crowd. In the end, 5 people lay dead. And one person, notably, the first person killed in the Revolutionary War, was a man named Crispus Attucks. And he was actually an African-American man. Little known fact, the first blood that was shed in this war was that of an African-American man. He was actually a freed slave. So this image is really kind of the most important part of the Boston Massacre. Oddly enough, you think 5 people dying. That sounds horrible. But more importantly, the after effect of that. So there was a revolutionary named Paul Revere. Paul Revere was one of the leaders of the American Revolutionary War, and he was a member of a group known as the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were a group of generally wealthy, well-to-do, and well-connected American colonists who resisted British taxation. And they were, by the way, the individuals who stood to lose the most by these British taxes, being wealthy themselves. So he was a great artist, and he also was a newspaper man. And he was good at making engravings. So what you're looking at here is an engraving of the Boston Massacre. He ran this in his newspaper, and pretty soon it spread like wildfire. What you see in this image, you see British soldiers callously killing innocent American colonists. Do you think he may have had some sort of agenda here when he made this engraving? The answer is yes, we know he did. He was trying to paint the most violent, terrible picture of the British regular army and painting the colonists as just innocent people who are getting shot here. The bottom line, though, it worked. The effect of this engraving and the news of the Boston massacres spread throughout the colonies like wildfire. And really the after effect of which was they lost trust. American colonists lost trust in the British Army as the people who would protect them. So the Boston Massacre is considered to be one of those important tipping points in the road to the Revolutionary War. It was named the Boston Massacre by Paul Revere, who made that engraving. He also had the help of another revolutionary by the name of Samuel Adams, who, by the way, is widely considered to be the most radical of all the American revolutionaries during the Revolutionary War. Okay, why do they call it a massacre? To upset people. The name stuck, and it worked. It worked amazingly. This is where it happened. If you go to Boston today, the site of the Boston Massacre on King Street, still there. Boston's a very old city and very much proud of their history as really the birthplace of the American Revolution. These are the Sons of Liberty. When I said they're all pretty much wealthy, well-to-do men, that's absolutely the case. Not a lot of Sons of Liberty were poor people. And they organized protests. They organized boycotts of British goods. So these guys were actually critical in the whole process of the Revolutionary War. And he may have been one too, although he lived in London, I'm pretty sure. So this is the kind of stuff you would see the Sons of Liberty put out. It's basically an organization of a protest. They would put flyers all over the city of Boston saying, hey, at such and such time, we are going to be doing a protest. They would force stamp collectors to have to leave their jobs. All kinds of crazy things like that. But they were really instrumental in creating what eventually would be a war. So one of the most famous things that the Sons of Liberty did was the Boston Tea Party. Now, the Boston Tea Party was a reaction to a tax cut, actually, oddly enough. You know, when you think about, oh my gosh, the colonists are fighting against taxes. Oh, we hate taxes. But at the same time, they didn't want tax breaks for British companies. So here's the long and the short of it. The Boston Tea Party was a reaction of a tax cut that was on British imported tea. Now, here's the thing about the Revolutionary War. A lot of the Sons of Liberty were actually smugglers. They would illegally move goods into America and avoid paying British duties on those goods. So the British, in reaction to these smugglers, who were basically undercutting the market on tea. Now, tea is the bomb for colonists. The British love tea. The colonists at this time also loved tea. And you could get cheaper imported tea that was imported illegally that didn't have to pay the duties on that. And so the British were like, what the heck? We can't keep up with the market here. The tea's too cheap. That's coming in illegally. So in order to make their tea cheaper, they cut the taxes on officially made British imported tea. This infuriated the Sons of Liberty, and they decided to take matters into their own hands. So late at night, this is the famous story. I'm sure you've heard of this. The Sons of Liberty dress up as Native Americans. Now, that's kind of an odd thing to do. Why would they do that? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. They were trying to break away from the British Empire. Who were the real Americans? The only true born forever Americans? Well, the Native Americans are. They've always been there. So they dressed up like Indians in an effort to basically identify themselves as true Americans. I don't know. It's just what they did. So late at night, they had organized a group of people to go throw a whole boatload of British tea into the harbor at Boston. And they did. And this, folks, was it. You know, you have a lot of steps along the way that you can't ignore, but there's one gigantic step that happens right here at the end. The Boston Tea Party sent England into an absolute rage. The King of England at this time was a guy named King George III. King George III was absolutely beside himself, enraged at the Americans that have the nerve to throw our tea into the harbor. This was like one step too far in the minds of the British aristocracy, the king, and the parliament. And the result was a set of new laws that basically locked down Boston. This is what they said. Boston's government is no longer theirs. We are taking over Boston. We will take care of this city. They shut the Boston harbor down. They said no more goods are going to come in and out of this harbor until you replace every dime of the value of that tea. The worst thing that they did is they said, you know what, we've had British soldiers here in America for a heck of a long time. And you know what you're going to have to do, colonists? You're going to have to let them live in your house. So they passed this law called the Quartering Act. You can imagine how upset that would make you. You're like, what? You mean you tell me that my house is no longer my castle and you are going to decide who gets to sleep inside of my house? And I'm an American colonist who is anti-British and it has to be a British soldier? Oh, no, 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 no. So you can see how this was just like, this is the breaking point. This is where tensions had just gone too far. And it was because the Sons of Liberty had this idea of, hey, let's make the British mad. Basically, you poke the bear until that bear attacks, and then that you get what you want. And this I love. Slogans of the American Revolution. The reason I love this is because they're so familiar. It's kind of funny to see how history kind of has through lines. There's little paths where things today that we see and are familiar with have made it all the way from 1773. So these are slogans of the revolution. Every revolution needs slogans, and some of them, they just sound so right, don't they? Beware of products from China, aka British products that come from China, British stuff. No, no, no. Buy American. Obviously, that means buy stuff from the colonists, not British made goods. These are boycotts. This is one of my favorites. Wage war on drugs. Well, the war on drugs started in like the 1960s with Richard Nixon here in America, and it was a war on illegal drugs like heroin and stuff like that. In the revolution, wage war on drugs did not mean heroin or cocaine or something like illegal drugs. What it meant was tea. There were doctors that were paid by the colonists, by the patriots, to come up with reasons that tea would make you go insane. And so they try to consider tea an actual drug. Down with corporations. Down with anything British. So here's an image of the Boston Tea Party. This is very inaccurate because the Boston Tea Party happened in the dead of night. This wasn't a public spectacle as you see here. Here's another image of the Boston Tea Party. Once again, you see these activities that really don't make sense. You didn't have a crowd out there in the background. There it is right there. It was cold. It was wintertime and it was nighttime. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't have had your shirt off, but you look pretty tough. And I don't know how these guys look so young and healthy. They're like old. Why are they destroying their own tea? Said no history book ever. That's kind of the funny, ironic thing about it. That tea was destined to go into the bellies of colonists. There it is, SpongeBob. What can you say? It's just right. Okay, so I kind of find it interesting that here in America, coffee is the drink of choice, the morning drink of choice by almost everybody. I mean, come on, just go around Twin Falls. There's a coffee shop like around every single corner. All right, we have like, there's 2 Starbucks, there's 2 Dutch Bros, there's Java, there's, I don't know, on and on and on and on and on. How many tea shops do we have? Think about that. If you go to England, they have tea shops. So where did this love of coffee come from? Well, it was a revolution. See, revolutionaries wanted to boycott anything British. They didn't want the British to get anything from them. And so they actually boycotted tea. And drinking tea was considered very unpatriotic. And drinking coffee was patriotic. And so here's the birth of the love of coffee in America. And I don't know about this, but you may not know this, but the fun fact, Americans have surpassed Turkey, the nation, not the animal, as the country that drinks the most coffee per capita of any country in the world. We're highly caffeinated. Oh, there it is. Ah, nothing more American than drinking coffee during the revolution. Oh, why not? Just because. Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's just not even an American, he's an Austrian. I guess he's an American now, but not by birth. So tensions are ramping up. Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, and another interesting individual in this war who also incited revolutionary thoughts in the minds of colonists. Because you got to keep in mind, you have to like kind of wake people up. You know, if you want a revolution, you have to get a lot of people on board here. And there's this guy named Thomas Paine. He was a newspaper writer, and he wrote pamphlets, he wrote books, he was a prolific writer. And Thomas Paine wrote a super duper important and influential pamphlet called Common Sense. Common Sense was a relatively short read, easy to print, widely distributed, huge hit bestseller that colonists read wide and far, far and wide, and it basically made the argument that America should be an independent nation and that the British government is too complex, it's too corrupt, and that we need to start fresh. So, you know, a lot of American colonists who really didn't like British taxation weren't necessarily saying, let's become our own country. They just wanted reform. They wanted to remain British subjects, but they wanted things to be fixed. They wanted more independence, and they wanted to have the taxes go away. Thomas Paine plants the seed of revolution, the seed of we just need to start fresh. And his essential argument, the bedrock of it, is Britain is too complicated, too corrupt. Why bother? We need to break away. And one thing that he really slams in Common Sense over and over again is the concept of a monarchy, of a king. Because, you know, England is kind of a monarchy. King George III has power in England, but ultimately the real decision power laid with Parliament at this point in history. And Parliament is kind of similar to Congress here in America. It's an elected body. It's not a king. But King George still was, I guess, basically a scapegoat. Thomas Paine painted Britain as just a good old-fashioned monarchy. So Common Sense. Totally interesting aside about Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, after his death, was buried on his farm in New York. Another newspaper editor decided that he was going to dig up his body and move it back to England, where he hoped the English would be willing to create a gigantic and very important memorial to him, you know, some kind of thing. But he went to England with Thomas Paine's body. He literally like had his body in a box and took it back to England. And by the way, he dug it up. It was already buried, which is very bizarre. And the British, of course, said, no, this is the guy who, like, you know, ruined our whole colony situation in America. Why would we make something for him? So this newspaper editor is like, oh, bummer. So he has a farm in England. He goes to his farm in England, and shortly thereafter he dies. Thomas Paine is still in a box, like his bones are in a box. His son inherits that box, and he's like, what am I going to do with Thomas Paine's like body? And so Thomas Paine's body just remained with his son for a little while. And he's like, you know what, I'm going to sell it because this guy is a super famous guy. You know, Thomas Paine's a big deal. So maybe I'll get some money off this body. And the auctioneers are like, no, we don't sell human bodies. So sorry, you're going to have to do something else with this. Well, in the end, we don't know what happened to his body. Thomas Paine's unfortunate soul is, I mean, his soul is where his soul is, but his body, I mean, it's just gone. No one really knows where Thomas Paine's body is. There have been reports that parts of it are in certain areas of the world, like, oh, his legs in Australia. Oh, his left arm, it's in Sotheby, England. Or, you know, where's his head at? Well, his head's in France somewhere. So no one really knows. It's kind of crazy. Weird how history works, right? Protesting ramps up. It gets worse and worse and worse. And what you're seeing here is another example of a tax collector being tarred and feathered. What you can see right here is a guy right here with this spoon, and he's about to ladle out some tar. They're going to throw that tar on that individual and then cover them with feathers. Yum, yum. There's King George III. And this image of him really encapsulates the hatred that colonists had for a monarch. A man who is wealthy, born rich, doesn't have to work, and basically lives a life apart of average people, who doesn't necessarily believe in things like human rights, human dignity, liberty, and all that stuff. So here's King George III, the scapegoat of the revolution. Even though the man didn't have a whole heck of a lot of power in England, he became a symbol of everything the colonists wanted to get rid of. So the laws that I mentioned earlier after the Boston Tea Party were known as the coercive acts by the British. Coercing is forcing someone to do something. Like if I coerce someone to do something, I make them do it against their will. In America, they didn't call it the coercive acts. They call it the intolerable acts because they could not tolerate these laws. These are what were included. The Quartering Act, like I said, forcing colonists to allow British soldiers into their house. A blockade of the British harbor. Took control of the government of Massachusetts. By the way, you see how there's two F's there? That, if you were in class, you would know that's a joke, because an old-timey English writing at this time in history, in the middle of a sentence, if you had an S, it essentially looked like an F. In the end, this would lead to the beginning of the war. And there's a famous saying, it's called the shot heard around the world. The shot heard around the world is what we consider the first shot of the Revolutionary War. And that happened in a very small battle known as Lexington and Concord. And the next lesson that we go over is going to be the course of the war. What happened throughout the Revolutionary War? Peace.